So now we're back for our talk, and let me introduce our speaker today. Nicci Obholzer is part of the collections team at Sissinghurst Castle Garden. This is a UK National Trust property, most famous for its garden, but also with Nicci, it's beginning to take down from the shelves and unpack the histories of its owners, Vita Sackville-West and Harold Nicolson. Harold was a diplomat, politician, and writer. The couple traveled very widely, and this profound exposure to foreign cultures is evident in the collection in the house, within their writing, but also through Nicci's ongoing research within the garden itself. Nicci recently co-curated with BIPS member Dr. Lindsay Allen an exhibition entitled Persian Paradise, Harold and Vita in Iran in 1925 through 1927, which made many new discoveries about Sissinghurst's collection, uncovering the extraordinary effect that Iran had on their aesthetic and imaginary world. Nicci has also worked at the National Trust's Smallhythe Place and Lamb House, the houses of actresses and writers, and has a strong interest in women's lives in the early 20th century. Before that, Nicci worked at the Freud Museum in London and in the House of Lords. Thanks to the Royal Oak Foundation funding, Sissinghurst was able to get its large photographic archive digitized. This included Harold Nicolson and Vita Sackville-West's Persia and Bakhtiari albums, which enabled some really high-resolution zooming in on what are otherwise rather small photographs. Through collaboration with BIPS members Lindsay Allen, Firuza Melville, and Charles Melville, as well as other academics from University College London, the Chester Beatty in Dublin, and the Victoria and Albert Museums, we were able to learn so much more about Sissinghurst's Iranian collection. Vita and Harold's writings, as well as that of their contemporaries, also made new sense once their Iranian context was restored. The resulting A Persian Paradise, Vita and Harold in Iran, 1925 through 29 exhibition, sponsored by BIPS and the Iran Society, became Sissinghurst's most visited exhibition ever, reaching coverage in national, international television and print media. Nicci will reflect on the new research which led to this exhibition and where this takes Sissinghurst's new understanding of its collection and of that cadre of people connected to Iran in the early 20th centuries. Nicci will speak for a certain amount of time, then the balance will be devoted, and that time is down to her, the balance will be devoted to Q&A, and again, for those people who are joining a bit late, please use the Q&A function on Zoom for all your questions. And without further taking up any more time, Nicci, the floor literally and figuratively is yours.
Thanks very much, Andrew. So hopefully I'm sharing now. Brilliant. In March 2023, I was asked by the programming manager to curate an exhibition using the then recently digitized photograph albums of Vita Sackville-West and Harold Nicolson, which in 2 separate volumes recorded 2 years of travel to and from Iran in the mid-1920s. These fascinating leather-bound photograph albums, titled in sequence Persia 1926 and the Bakhtiari Road 1927, just predate the Nicholsons' acquisition of the property that now underpins their memory in the National Trust world. They owned Sissinghurst from 1930 until their deaths in 1962 and 1968. Both are known now as writers and gardeners, but in the 1920s, Harold was an experienced but junior diplomat. Harold's posting to Iran and Vita's decision to turn her 2 visits to join him into exploratory journeys led to much more than the creation of these photo albums. Their images, rather, were the starting point in piecing together a much bigger story. Harold began his posting in 1925, serving under Sir Percy Lorraine. Vita arranged to travel out to meet him with fellow poet and Vita's erstwhile lover, notwithstanding Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Wellesley, on the 20th of January 1926, at a point where her friendship with Virginia had finally become sexually and emotionally intimate. Harold and Vita's letters tell the stories of much of their lives while apart and break for action and imagery when they rejoined each other and the pictures take over. Vita spent 4 months in Iran on the first visit, participating in the coronation. He returned the following year at the beginning of February, and they embarked on a more elaborate overland journey, including a motor tour to Persepolis and a donkey and mule train down the Bakhtiari Road towards Abadan. While in Tehran, they lived in a house in the large embassy compound where Harold had been born in 1886. His father, Arthur, had been posted there between 1885 and 1888. The newly digitized images allowed me to really zoom in on the details, and I began to wonder about the places and the people within them. I looked up what Iranian objects we had recorded on our database, but the details were fairly scant and equivocal. I contacted the British Institute of Persian Studies, therefore, to seek expertise and potential sponsorship of this exhibition. What resulted has been an overwhelming embrace of interest and kindness and support from various Iranologists. Huge thanks are due to Firuza and Charles Melville, who set the ball rolling, making a visit to Sissinghurst in March 2023, bringing with them another BIPS member, Lindsay Allen, who became co-curator. Lindsay was already familiar with the potential of Sissinghurst as a place of exploration, having sought out Vita's piece of Persepolis in 2016. Generous financial support from BIPS funded the exhibition text panels. As we expanded our exhibition to include audio-visual materials, a grant from the Iran Society allowed us to feature 2 films in the exhibition. In the Oast, near to the photographic material showing the journey through the Zagros Mountains on the Bakhtiari Road, we showed an excerpt of the famous film, 1925 film, Grass, which will have influenced Vita and Harold's own aspirations and perceptions during their trip. Through reading the postscripts in letters between Virginia Woolf and Vita, we knew that they had seen the film together, which added an extra dimension to the significance of the film. It was an amazing thing to walk into the Oast on a twice daily basis, to see so many people sitting on the benches or upon the floor cushions, gripped by this footage of the challenging mountainous terrain of Western Iran. Meanwhile, in the library, we showed a brief Pathé news clip originating in a then recent European road trip to Iran. Major Forbes Leith and his filmographer, Montague Redknapp, drove from Leeds to Quetta via Iran in 1925. Pathé's chosen trip from their journey showed them visiting Persepolis in tropical shorts and pith helmets, accompanied by local gendarmes on horseback. The silent clip illustrated the condition of the ruins in the 1920s before excavations began in 1931, and the romantic prospect it was to European tourists. Our research and exhibition drafting intensified in the summer. We kept making new discoveries as we researched text and labels. For instance, Vita wrote about being given a string of coral beads by the Bakhtiari Ilkhan he had been handling as he discussed politics with Harold. She said that they were on her desk as she was writing. And this rang a bell. I recalled indistinctly as I was reading, seeing coral beads, and the next day rushed up to her famous writing room, and there they were. It was incredibly exciting. Again, on our database, there was no information about them at all, and now we had possible provenance. Beads were displayed with Vita's account in the exhibition next to photographs of the journey. One Sunday afternoon after lunch, I was browsing the Monk's House National Trust website. Monk's House in Rodmell, Sussex, was the country home of the world-famous novelist Virginia Woolf. I knew that Vita had given Virginia one of the turquoise so-called cog or salt dishes she had bought in Tehran as a gift when she returned from Iran. I was looking for its catalogue number so that I could request it to be loaned for the exhibition. I wanted to reunite it with Vita's assorted collection of these dishes, illustrating, through Vita's gifts, their closeness at the time that Vita was in Iran. Scrolling through the database, I was suddenly confronted with another very distinctive pattern of wools on grey stone. I immediately thought I must be tired. I must have accidentally secured or searched on the Sissinghurst website. But no, there it was, another piece of Persepolis with a slightly nicer surface than Harold's. The catalogue entry identified it as a fossil. After giving Lindsay a heart attack via WhatsApp when I shared this new discovery, it sent me back to Vita and Virginia's letters and to Vita's account on her trip to Persepolis. She talked about exploring the partially excavated 100-columned hall there, about picking up, quote, fragments of carving, small enough to go into a pocket, but pulled with the curls of an Assyrian beard. Wars and dynasties roll their forgotten drums as the fragment is balanced for a moment in the palm of the hand. Virginia later referred to the stone that came from Persepolis, the 3 curls of the emperor's beard I always think it is, a special fragment that Vita had given to her, now holding up letters on Virginia's mantelpiece. Vita had given 1 pulled fragment each to both her husband, Harold, and her lover, Virginia. This newly understood love token gave yet more context to the object, but also offered the exhibition a compelling and marketing headline. This meant we were able to get Persepolis fragments, Vita's ceramics, from the bazaar and their journey photographs into the Daily Mail. At this point in August 2023, Paul Wordsworth of UCL came to Sissinghurst to examine in closer detail the Iranian ceramics. His assessment was that Vita and Harold's collection was of varying dates and confirmed Lindsay's suspicion that the, in theory, less spectacular round-bottomed jars were in fact very early indeed, and therefore, in fact, very spectacular. In the weeks preceding the exhibition opening, we made new discoveries all the time. Frenetic text writing and rewriting sometimes went on until 2 a.m. as we tried to communicate complex political, historical, and archaeological topics to a very broad National Trust audience. We incorporated new insights until the very last minute. A day or 2 before our final exhibition texts were sent to be printed, we realized a Nicholson family photo album that had been labelled as depicting Arthur's parents and siblings in Morocco, in fact showed many views of the British Embassy compound in central Tehran in the 1880s. We owe thanks, enormous thanks, to Moya Carey for providing After Midnight, comparable photograph of the embassy main building front door confirmed this. The 1880s views show that Harold was born in one of the diplomatic residences only yards from where he lived and cultivated a garden over 40 years later. We included one photograph of this in the library display. Apologies for this as I sort through my photographs again. That was not all. A couple of days before the exhibition opened and after the interpretation boards and labels had all been printed, Adam Nicholson, Harold and Vita's grandson, produced 2 large turquoise ceramic tiles that he offered to loan. Fuchsia Hart identified the fragmentary words on them as Quranic, meaning that they had been there from a religious structure, perhaps not in Iran itself. We had no documentary information about where they had come from, nor knew yet how Harold and Vita originally came to own them, but they were clearly connected to their interest in Persian culture. They also illustrated the kind of typical interwar collecting that Harold and Vita were engaging in, not just ceramic vessels and fragments, but structural ornamentation too. Let me try and find them again. There we go. These objects were too important to turn down, so we drafted urgent loan agreements and extra labels. Adam brought the tiles to Sissinghurst on the afternoon of the private view, As he signed the loan agreement, he told me that he was delighted that this exhibition, with its Iranian focus, could contribute to illuminate Sissinghurst's global connections. After a press review, the exhibition opened on the 13th of October and immediately drew media attention. BBC South East interviewed Lindsay and me for a clip that ended up on every news programme, including the national BBC breakfast programme, the following day. The visiting journalist had felt strongly that he wanted to cover the exhibition because his wife was Iranian and he wanted his children growing up in the UK to learn more about their culture. Meanwhile, Lindsay wrote an article for the Times Lux Online magazine and other outlets as diverse as the Daily Mail and Iran Wire covered different aspects of the exhibition. Our winter activity programming for the duration of the exhibition included a poetry reading for Yalda, an event for Nowruz, and the installation of Sissinghurst's first half-sin table, a tradition we hope to continue. We held an Iranian painting workshop and spring conference day, which sold out. BIPS and external colleagues joined us for this day in March, to which Ali Ansari, Paul Wordsworth and Boucher Hart all contributed. Their papers helped to illuminate the deeper context of the exhibition. Their work indicated to us how much further we could take our findings and interpretations in print. For example, new ideas continue to be made and emerge in the conference room. Fuchsia gave a fascinating talk on her research on diplomatic gifting in the Qajar period. The starting point was one of our star objects. Nasser al-Din Shah Qajar had given a diamond snuff box to Arthur Nicholson, Harold's father. Within the snuff box was a folded piece of paper which bore a crested letterhead. On one side was Persian text to accompany the gift, and on the other, its English translation. Moya Carey from the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin leant forward because she recognised the handwriting and suggested that the translation was written by Sidney Churchill, who had become the embassy secretary because of his proficiency in speaking and writing Persian. Churchill also accompanied Nasser al-Din Shah on his European tour. When the symposium broke up for lunch, a group of us went to inspect and explore an Iranian carpet that Harold had bought in Istanbul early in his career, which is currently in storage. They concluded that its cataloguing as 18th century was likely incorrect, as it was more modern than that. It could have been made in northwest Iran in the late 19th century. The audience for the symposium was broad. They were expat Iranians and others from London and the Southeast, keen to learn more about Harold and Vita's involvement in Iran and the inspiration they had drawn from it. They were interior decorators, ceramicists, diplomats, and gardeners, keen to learn more about the influences of Harold and Vita's aesthetic choices inside their home and outside in their garden. I was particularly moved by one person who had attended because they belonged to a local National Trust Association. I had invited to have a curator-led tour of the exhibition. They had been pretty challenging about the National Trust being, quote, woke because of our board on Orientalism. We had had a discussion about it, but then they had returned to Sissinghurst, signed up and paid money to come to the symposium because they wanted to drill down into the detail of it. So much had the exhibition moved and interested them. They were enthralled by the breadth of topics covered, from Iranian nationalism to novelty souvenir ceramics, from travel literature to bejeweled daggers. The written feedback for the exhibition over its extended period, from October 2023 to March 2024, was generally overwhelmingly positive. Visitor numbers increased over that winter period compared to the previous year by 52%, an unprecedented figure. Just to say, I asked for numbers on these, but I haven't received them yet, but I'm sure I can produce them should anyone want them. When I set about preparing an exhibition on Vita and Harold in Iran, I had actually wondered if there would be sufficient books and objects to make a decent display. In the end, we had so many objects, so many threads and themes that we decided to use 2 large spaces, something that's never happened before at Sissinghurst. These were the Oast exhibition space near to the site entrance and the library space inside Sissinghurst Castle proper. We divided our focus so that the light Oast space could be used to explain many cultural and political experiences of the 1920s in Iran, while the more intimate library space was about personal relationships between people and objects and family history. We went from the very general to the very particular across these 2 spaces, from perspectives on the global relationship between Britain and Iran to the personal experience of it by these 2 individuals in the early 20th century. To achieve this, we used objects and images from many different eras, opening with an early modern English map of Persia from Vita's writing room, one of 2 the couple owned. Harold's birth in Tehran, when his father was secretary of the legation, had left him with a lasting sense of connection to the country. On his return, he wrote to Vita that Iran seizes one by the throat. Vita, meanwhile, had been raised with a somewhat romantic view of Iran, informed partly by the early modern decors of her childhood at her ancestral home of Knoll, and partly by fin de siècle Orientalism, which drew heavily on the Arabian Nights. This photograph shows Vita on the left and Olive Rubens, who happened to be her father's lover, on the right. Vita had written an Eastern fantasy, which she and her family and friends performed at a Knoll house party. One of Vita's future lovers, Rosamund Grosvenor, played Zuleika, whilst another future and much more significant lover, Violet Keppel, played a slave. We drew attention to these Orientalist tropes in the panel. However, we were able to show, again, through their photographs, publications, and personal comments, that Harold and Vita developed a growing awareness of real life in Iran and the effects of British colonial and commercial activity there. The Nicholsons, father and son, were diplomats in Iran during decades of great transformation, when Britain competed with other powers for strategic influence and assets. Britain still used the Persian Gulf as a naval and communications hub. In the 1880s, Arthur had supported the British-run telegraph system that formed an essential link to India. Over 40 years later, Harold returned to Iran in a similar role at a time when the Anglo-Indian Oil Company and consequently the British Navy and worldwide market were exploiting Iran's natural resources. Harold's arrival also coincided with big constitutional changes at the transition from Qajar rule to the coronation of Reza Shah. Harold and Vita attended the coronation in April 1926, and Vita's dramatic chapter about the coronation in her first book, Passenger to Tehran, 1926, ranged between impressions of the present day and imagined memories of a female traveller in the Iranian court of the 1880s. I'm sorry I haven't included photographs here, but I had trouble downloading them for this bit. Harold was sceptical of Reza Khan behind the scenes, and this criticism of his superior's favoured policy earned him a demotion on his return to London. Despite our focus on Iran, his ODNB biographer described it as the nadir of his career. Once he had left the service, he still wrote about his admiration of Iran's culture and landscape, albeit he never returned there. The life of a diplomatic spouse bored Vita, but in her descriptions and her letters home, particularly those to Virginia Woolf, she responded rapturously to the Iranian landscape, describing the light and the space and the colour that sweeps in waves like a blush over a proud and sensitive face. Hers, perhaps. The life of a diplomatic spouse bored Vita. Together, Harold and Vita took trips to collect plants, exploring both the country around Tehran and also the routes south to Isfahan and Shiraz. And then we move to the space from the Oost into the library, their domestic space. Exhibiting possessions in the library brings us much closer to the Nicholsons' domestic space and personal life. The long-standing decor of the space mingled inherited pieces from Noel with their own acquisitions, and we blended loans and labels into the space, resting Harold's elementary Persian grammar on the family's lacquered Iranian bookstand. In this charming children's book, Harold had written phonetically how the letters sounded to help himself learn Persian. However, on his first meeting with Reza Shah, he reported he was so nervous, he exclaimed, "Goodbye, Your Majesty." And in fact, in one of his diaries, one of his letters to Vita, he has sketched himself with his shoelaces undone in order to express how nervous he was that they had undone themselves in their own nervousness on approaching the Shah. Nearby, we placed an illustrated manuscript of Sadi, an acquisition which may have dated from Harold's father's time in Iran. We highlighted key works of Iranology or Iran-oriented travel writing with introductory labels on the library shelves. The dark and burnished library was the best place to display the glazed ceramics, something Vita would have appreciated. Vita wrote to Virginia on the 20th of March, 1927, "I've been buying in large quantities the most lovely Persian pottery bowls and fragments, dim greens and lustrous blues, on which patterns, figures, camels, cypresses, script sport themselves elusive and fragmentary. How I'm going to get them all home, God knows. For the moment, they stand around my room, creating a rubbed, romantic life of forgotten centuries. It's like looking into a pool and seeing very far down a dim reflection. I make all sorts of stories about them." Such pieces had already become popular collectibles in Europe in the late 19th century, their shades and patterns exerting an influence on British design. Currently, we understand that some of Harold and Vita's ceramics may have come from the Istanbul Bazaar. Some sherds were scavenged from the ruins of medieval Roy, where they sometimes picnicked south of Tehran, and other partial or restored pieces were purchased in the Tehran Bazaar. Our exhibition journey included many facets of this British encounter of Iranian culture and tried as far as possible to offer clear and correct information about many things that had previously been hidden or obscured. Because it is always a topic of great fascination, we also touched on Harold and Vita's relationship with each other and with their many lovers, their everyday experiences of work, travel, and writing. There are so many of these forgotten but resonant details, photos of Harold under a car or Vita pushing one, that we hope to return to and make greater use of them in the presentation of their lives in the future. So what is the legacy of the Persian Paradise exhibition? Because of the short time frame, we effectively did a lot of the conventional exhibition process backwards. We recommend not doing this. It has, however, made exploratory, ongoing research very inviting and productive. For the exhibition outline, we worked around the core elements of Vita's narratives, Harold's diaries and letters, their photographs, and the objects already identified as having come from Iran. On the eve of the exhibition, we were still identifying and dating new or understudied objects, finding metadata for photographs, and working out the storage locations of any Persian carpets. We finally got a carpet Harold had bought in Istanbul out during the lunch hour of our workshop. And I have to say a huge thank you to Grace Dickens here, who works in the collections department at Sissinghurst, for both enabling and carrying this. So on top of the basic narrative of the exhibition, we now have aims inspired by that experience. Firstly, To get all new and correct data on objects from Iran entered as metadata on the NT database, including for objects we only sort of reassessed at the start of, during, or after the exhibition. This is something we will do in collaboration with the National Trust Cultural Heritage Curator. And second, to capture the thinking, finding, and conversations surrounding the exhibition, both in the object database, but also to develop a more National Trust user-friendly catalogue format. To build the catalogue, we will be expanding sources that we use to reconstruct Harold's time in Iran. Lindsay and I will be following up an exploratory visit to Balliol College that Paul already started, where the Niccolson papers included Harold's diaries from his time in Iran. These may not tell us exactly where he and Vita bought individual collection items, but it will help us to understand their paths and networks around Tehran outside the embassy grounds. The planned catalogue has broadened to include objects that were not in the exhibition because of insufficient space, information, or conservation. This includes some very degraded Safavid revival paintings, possibly of the late 19th century, and these need conservation and additional description. Meanwhile, these Qajar playing cards were traditionally stored in the library desk and were catalogued as Russian because one had a Russian newspaper stuck to it, as you can see here. These might have been an acquisition. These also need conservation and recataloguing. Another object, this time from the exhibition, is going through conservation, which is the illustrated Sadi poetry manuscript. It might have been an acquisition dating from Harold's father time in Iran rather than Harold himself. Happily, this job has coincided with a new national curatorial appointment by the National Trust, Dr. Nur Sobers Khan, as a South Asia curator. As someone with great experience in manuscript collections and Persianate culture, this will be good news for the Iranian collections across many National Trust properties. She has already been able to oversee the rebinding of our Sissinghurst Shadi manuscript by our manuscripts conservator. It was the exhibition which increased this manuscript's visibility, highlighted its need for conservation, and enabled it to be selected for dedicated funding from the Royal Oak Foundation. Search is still being carried out when time allows into where the funerary bowls came from, who potentially acquired them in order that Harold and Vita could buy them. Even though we have only made first steps of the catalogue, the content and message of the exhibition, raising awareness of the impact of Harold's years in Iran on Vita and on Sissinghurst and their social circles, has already been disseminated further for repackaging in new context. This year, the Garden Museum held an exhibition entitled Gardening Bohemia, which featured the gardens of Vanessa Bell, Virginia Woolf, Ottilie Morel, and Vita Sackville-West. The exhibition curator, Dr. Claudia Tobin, made 2 research visits to Sissinghurst, the second time specifically to view the A Persian Paradise exhibition. As a result, the Garden Museum's Vita section places strong emphasis on the influence that Vita's travels in Iran had on the Nicholson's garden at Sissinghurst. The visibility of this specialist collection of 1920s Iran and associated artifacts and ideas came about directly as a result of the support for the Sissinghurst Source exhibition from BIPS and the Iran Society. The process of putting together the Iran section for the Garden Museum exhibition also benefited from discoveries arising after the A Persian Paradise exhibition. For instance, a descendant of the diplomat Gladwin Jebb had attended our opening. and was prompted to re-examine the travel diary of Gladwin's sister, Dorothy, who accompanied the party. Dorothy's delightful scrapbook records the journey which was on display with loans from Sissinghurst, a really satisfying display combination. I'll just go back to that to show you. Above them were some rather better Safavid-inspired miniatures from another Nicolson family member, another potential loan we had not been aware of until all convened at the Persian Paradise. This revival of interest in Vita's travels may go further than our exhibition records and cataloguing. I understand that there are plans afoot to republish Vita's Iranian travelogues and possibly that of Dorothy Jebbs. The slowly unfolding impacts of our initial splash of winter colour at Sissinghurst will likely reach further than we can currently predict.
Right, Nicci, thank you so very, very much. Very enjoyable. I myself was not able to get down, but I feel as if I've had a really excellent tour and overview, and also a discussion of the significance of the material to which BIPS contributed here in the mounting of this mounting of the exhibition. Again, I'm taking questions for Nicci on the Q&A function in Zoom. I already have one question here about the digitized photos of the two albums being available online.
They are available to researchers, so you have to come in to Sissinghurst to see them.
And is the catalog going to be available online?
The catalogue is probably 18 months, couple of years off.
Oh, okay.
And so we're still negotiating all of that.
Right. Okay, and presumably you'll be making additions and such to the
Indeed.
catalog as when you get subsequent material between,
exactly,
as you were updating up to the very last minute here.
Yes, and still are.
Yes, terrific. It's terrific. Can I ask you a little bit about their life after they came back from Iran, being a foreigner by origin? I'm not so very familiar with him, even though people talk about his diaries, for example. I'm not really familiar with him as a personality on the British, not to say English, scene.
Yes.
So can you tell me a little bit
Oh,
about
I see.
his,
Okay.
yeah.
So after he was in Iran, he desperate as he was to leave the diplomatic service, he didn't get a job immediately and couldn't find any way of financing himself properly. And so he was then posted to Berlin, Weimar, Berlin, and was there from 27 to 29. And that is also an extremely, we actually covered that period of his life before the Persia exhibition, and that's another fascinating section of his life, a very interesting period in European history. And Vita went over there occasionally as well. You know, she only went over there twice. She did not enjoy the role of a diplomat's wife. But it was a very kind of interesting and fluid moment in European history, obviously. And then after that, I think he basically had enough, and he managed to secure himself enough journalistic jobs, albeit that he gave them up quite quickly thereafter. But they were high paying for a while. Comparatively, and Vita was earning a lot of money through her novels that they were able to buy Sissinghurst whilst remaining in their other home, Longbarn, and manage the two just about. So it was the sort of, I would call it almost the tipping point. It was all sort of the place they most wanted to go, and thereafter it was a tipping point for them sort of beginning to think about the next stage and sort of congregating all of those ideas about ruins and ancestry, and bringing in Noel to that, and then all of their own personal experiences, so that it wasn't just Noel, into Sissinghurst.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions. I'm still taking questions, again, via the Q&A function on Zoom at the bottom of the Zoom page. When will there we go, try again. When will we be able to watch a recording of this excellent talk? That's down to BIPS itself, and we do mount these. This one has been recorded, and so eventually this will come up and folks will be able to see it again via the BIPS website, and possibly also via the Sissinghurst website as well. Here's a question. When you discussed Saadi manuscript, there was a slide from a late 16th century copy with illustrations from Bukhara. The questioner recognizes the illustration and would like to know where the object is located.
Excellent. Well, at the moment, it's with the conservator. And as I said, Nursobus Khan has gone down there to make sure that all the illustrations are in the right place. But we are hoping that it might be back by the very latest. And I'm not going to hold anyone to this, but I'm hoping personally that it will be back by March, in order to time with another Nowruz celebration.
Okay. Another question, have you made a visit to Iran to visit where Harold and Vita stayed? What has become of their home there? Is there anything remaining?
I don't know whether it's remaining. I think it is, and I haven't, and I long to. And actually, since the exhibition, I've had so many staff members, including, well, particularly gardeners, who long to go and spend time in the landscape and experience what they did in order to understand better what it was they were trying to recreate at Sissinghurst.
Okay. Are there any discussions in the letters or diaries about there being Westerners in Iran at the time? Reza Shah took power approximately 1921. Did they write about the political situation in Tehran?
They did. I mean, other people have written about that period, perhaps not as lyrically as Vita did, but there are other reminiscences of that period, and possibly more, as you know, as you know, I feel like the Persian Paradise exhibition has started to rejuvenate interest in that period of these people at that time, and I feel that this is kind of like a right time for re-investigating that.
Okay, two questions about the gardens. I'll take them separately. Did Vita's experience in the Persian garden when in Iran have any influence upon her subsequent engagement in the design of her own gardens? That's first. And then secondly, could you elaborate a bit more on the plants that she selected for her garden and the way her travels to Iran might have influenced her choices?
So the first one is easy, and the second one I have lots and lots of crates for, but not to my fingertips. So I firmly believe that absolutely it had an influence, sort of color palette, plant choices, to some extent the style of the garden, although that's more not controversial, but sort of misty, because other people had been to Iran before her and had written about this stuff. But it was always part of her consciousness, I think, this kind of romanticism. And so, I mean, that's part of ongoing research, again, as I mentioned, that that I in particular am interested in, that we research the sort of Iranian influences in the garden, but I firmly feel that the sort of sunset colours of the cottage garden at Sissinghurst, or the sunken lion pond at Sissinghurst, are firmly Iranian influences, or indeed the kind of the structure of the box hedging in the White Garden. I was, you know, I could have chosen, and I did eventually, and then had to cull horrendously all the photographs, but I had included examples of these into the slideshow. But they are all not just by me, but they are considered sort of Iranian influences in the garden. And then again, the nuttery at the moment, and for some years now, has been very sort of driven by ferns with beautiful dual colours in between them. But when Vita was there initially, she had planted a bed of polyanthus, which she described as her Persian carpet. So so there are many influences. And then, sorry, I've forgotten the second.
Well, the second one was about the plants in particular.
Right, and I'm not a
but then-
gardener, so I'm glad I remembered the word polyanthus. But I'm not a gardener, but there are, there is the Rosa Isfahan, and there are many writings of hers where she has described the plants that she brought back or that Harold sent to her, irises and narcissi and roses, to mention but a few, and fritillaria that that she brought back and tried to cultivate, and then if she couldn't and she wasn't successful, she would then just try to buy, because she wanted the impact of the color, the shapes, the scent. It was it's my, at the moment, personal opinion that the garden is a reflection of love of travel, and Iran. Travels in Iran are right up there in the garden.
I had a question about Vita herself and whether she learned Persian or any other of the Iranian languages which were extant at the time, and to what extent did she engage with the languages? Also, did she, the same question, continue to celebrate Nowruz and Yalda after she left Iran, or was this only while they were there?
I'm almost certain, I've got no corroborative evidence of this at the moment, but I'm almost certain she would have learned that the sort of basics to be polite and get around. That was very much her modus operandi, and she was very good with languages, as was Harold. And it was something they prided themselves on, that they wanted to be able to be polite and civil in those languages. They were both multilingual. And yes, they did celebrate. There's just as one example that comes to the top of my head, there is an example of a book inscription, and most of their gifts to each other, they were pretty stingy with gifts, but most of them were books, quite often those that had been gifted to them because they were asked to review them, but nonetheless. There was one where, and I can't remember which way around it was, but one had gifted the other a book and said something like, to celebrate Nowruz, and that was in the mid-50s. So it was still something that they were very conscious of, throughout the rest of their lives, really.
I'm still taking questions from folks, although we're kind of running down, but the last few questions will be fine. I have a question here about a wonderful Victorian glass house and sunken cold frames in the residence garden at Ferdowsi where they lived. Did Vita refer to it at any stage?
Not to my knowledge. So that's interesting. I mean, she enjoyed all of those sorts of things because she was incredibly intellectual, and those things were sort of scientific, sort of studios for her, for want of a better word, but laboratories is the word I'm grasping for. But no, I've not heard that. I mean, I know that she did go to Iran one time with one of her lovers, Dorothy Wellesley, the wife of the first Duke of Wellington, who was also a poet, and she kept some of the plants that she brought back there in some glass houses that were on Dorothy Wellesley's estate. But the ones you refer to, I've not heard of. I'd be interested to learn more.
And they never got back to Iran. I mean, when they left, that was it.
It was it. I think it was partly, finance, partly, you're awfully protected, aren't you, when you're a diplomatic, part of the diplomatic sort of service, and paid for, and there was a lot more going on in their life. So, but I think almost that sort of made it a more solid memory that they always sort of, you know, kind of went back to when they, you know, throughout their lives, they were always saying, you know, when they went to America, they said, I've never seen hills like it apart from in Iran. They're almost as good as Iran, that sort of thing, you know.
Did they have correspondence with people back in Iran in Persian or any other language during the subsequent years?
That's something that I'm also trying to find out. I think they must have done, because they, you know, Harold kept in close contact with all his diplomatic colleagues for a very long time. And so probably Harold, if not Vita.
Right. Right. Well, I want to thank everybody for participating. This is absolutely terrific. As I say, I didn't get there, but I feel as if I was actually there and saw everything. And I want to thank you for being so gracious about BIP's contribution here to this. And I want to thank the people from BIPS who participated in this as well, many of whom you've named and talking about the days there. And I certainly look forward to the online catalog. And again, this talk has been recorded. And so when we are able to do so, we will put this back up for folks to be able to look to it again. There were a couple of comments here saying, terrific, wow, this is really great. Here's another comment, I wish I could have seen the exhibition in person. So terrific job, Nicci. Thank you so very much. I remind everybody that we have the AGM in November. There is a note about that I shared at the beginning of the slide, and that material, the talk by Robert Steele, which will be in commemoration of the Anne Lambton lecture as well, is also on that night. And here then from, I would like to say sunny Edinburgh, but it's dark and it's rainy, and from Sissinghurst and back down in England. Thank you all so very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing as many of you possible at future BIPS events, seminars, and webinars as well. Thank you all, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you may be. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.